I'm your host Sana Maqbool with you at PTV World. In today's show, we will be talking about a few important things. The first is in reference to, of course, what is going on in terms of the international relations and the much-awaited visit of the U.S. Secretary of State to China. And this is especially important given the kind of rift we've seen between the two countries, and especially in the past couple of months and year. We have seen that this has been marked even more substantially, especially since how there was a discussion around an alleged spy balloon by the Chinese over U.S. airspace. And when we take a look at the situation, especially in terms of the historical relations between the two countries, it seems that this visit holds a lot of significance, and perhaps too much was expected out of it as well. At the same time, we also know that the statements coming in are being referred to as positive, but without any substantial breakthrough or a substantial road ahead, which may be the expectation of one particular visit, as the U.S. Secretary of State said that it's going to take a lot of time for relations to stabilize, but at least that is the direction set. He also claimed that the objectives of the visit were in fact achieved, that the U.S. wanted to make sure that they are clear about what their reservations are and they communicate them, and then they set a path and move forward with trying to at least mobilize potential with reference to moving ahead in terms of improvement of relations. But we also know that the Chinese side, especially President Xi Jinping, in his communication had a stance with reference to military-to-military communication, citing, of course, U.S. sanctions as the hindrance. Then also we know that the issues such as Taiwan have always been there, which were referred to in statements as well regarding Chinese interests. And we have also seen in the post-visit briefing from the Chinese authorities that this is something that is still part of the discussion. Something that the president also mentioned was the little progress that has been achieved in specific areas, without explaining what that progress meant or what it was highlighting. However, in the general sense, we understand that the visit has perhaps only achieved a will to move forward and a symbolic movement in the relationship, but as to what that means in terms of a direction or actual steps that are going to be taken remains unclear, except that we perhaps know that the Chinese foreign minister may have accepted the invitation to a visit to the United States by the U.S. Secretary of State. So we're going to see what that means and whether or not there's a possibility of, in fact, the two leaders meeting later this year. Our next segment is going to take a look at the very important verdict that has been talked about in Pakistan regarding the Supreme Court judgments review law. The Supreme Court has reserved its verdict on the petitions that have challenged this law, but there was a lot of discussion with regards to the right of appeal under review law and whether or not that actually needs to be part of the legislation. There was also discussion in terms of procedural matters leading up to this law and how exactly that has been followed or pursued, and what sort of hindrances are present in terms of making sure that now there's no challenge to this particular law, and that in fact it is in the benefit of the Constitution and it does follow all procedure law, as was mentioned by the law minister. It also further outlines the fact that the kind of challenges that we have seen were referring to the interests in terms of the government or the ruling elite moving towards the particular involvement of the Chief Justice of Pakistan and their own interests, and not in the interest of the public. And this is important, especially in terms of what the law entails, but it has been clarified by the government that this is something that does not affect jurisdictions and it is not something against public interest. So we're going to take a look both at whether or not the right to appeal in review law needs to be there, and then whether or not the actual procedure was followed in terms of making sure that this law is in fact passed. Then we also will be talking about, at the end of the segment, unfortunately, the kind of tragedy that many people around the world, including hundreds of Pakistanis, have faced last week. And this is important, especially in terms of the kind of crisis we have seen, the refugee crisis that we have seen in the past, and that is still unfortunately continuing. The Prime Minister of Pakistan had earlier announced today as the day of mourning for the many lives that have been lost in this tragedy. And it's indeed the most unfortunate that the kind of reports that have been coming in point out towards how this may have been done with with reference to a targeted behavior towards certain communities, including Pakistanis and certain nationalities that were forced into a part of the deck that wasn't safe. And because of that, more and more lives of those particular nationalities have been lost. It also points towards what is being talked about as weaponizing crime by the European authorities, and the role that they've had to play in terms of deliberately moving forward and delaying rescue efforts, and how that is something that is being used as part of strategy. Of course, there needs to be a discussion as to how exactly this is happening, and whether or not there can be a certain check that in fact identifies that this is the case. Whatever is the reason, we are of course with the bereaved families, and we hope that the investigation at home at least continues for now, and that those who have been involved in this tragedy are brought to book. But we'll be talking about that at the end of this segment. For this and more, as always, in the studios, I've been joined, I'm not in the studios, online. I've been joined all the way from Quetta by Farrukh Pitafi. Thank you, Farrukh, for joining us online. It's about time you head back, because I keep mentioning you're in the studios while you are not. We're also going to be, we have been joined by Dr. Scott Lucas, who's joined us online. He's the Professor of International Politics, Clinton Institute, University College, Dublin. Thank you very much, Scott, for joining us and being a part of the discussion. And it's been a while since we've had you on our show, so it's a pleasure seeing you here. And Dr. Scott, we'll start with you with reference to what is going on. We talked earlier in our previous shows with reference to whether or not this visit is substantial. I understand that there is significance at the level at which this visit was conducted, and the fact that the U.S. Secretary of State has gone over to China, and that in itself may be a sort of a symbolic significance. But more than that, do you think that this visit does in fact set any sort of direction in terms of moving ahead? Perhaps expecting a breakthrough from the visit was a bit much, but the statements that are talking about a direction moving forward, do you think that at least that was in fact achieved?
Great to be back, especially with such an important visit, because I think the U.S. Secretary of State talking to the highest level officials in China, including Xi Jinping, is far more than symbolic. It's not a breakthrough on a specific issue, but it is a general breakthrough, which is getting both sides back to the rules of the game. What do I mean by rules of the game? Well, you could apply rules of the game, for example, in general to economic competition. We have had years of almost confrontation between the Americans and the Chinese, going back through the Trump administration. And the idea that these alternative economic systems, including their, the way they affect countries like Pakistan, that they could coexist, that's something that you search for. Now, we're not there yet, but let's talk about a specific issue with rules of the game. And the rules of the game on Taiwan, which is that on the one hand, China will not militarily overrun Taiwan, will not subjugate it through force. On the other hand, the United States and other countries in the international community will not recognize Taiwan as independent, breaking the one China policy. And then I think the new factor, which we faced for the last 18 months, which is the rules of the game over Ukraine. And that is that China is distancing itself from Moscow. There is a specific rule that it will not provide military assistance to the Russian invasion. But now, more than that, it's that China is tilting politically towards the middle. With its so-called peace plan, it is now treating Kiev and Moscow as equals in terms of a strategic relationship. All of those is very, very important, not only to the US, but to other countries, that China, in fact, work as a stabilizing influence. And I think when you add to that issues that will affect Pakistan, issues like climate change, for example, where the US and China can cooperate, issues in dealing with the post-pandemic effects of COVID-19, when you look at the rhetoric in the Chinese press today, it is so different from even a week ago, with the discussion of constructive communication, with the idea of mutual respect, and the American rhetoric is shifting as well. I don't want to be too optimistic about this. We have been burned in the past by being optimistic, but I think a return to pragmatism on both sides with effects for the international community, that's what we've seen this weekend.
All right. Farrukh, there is, of course, importance in terms of the kind of issues that are still really important in the relationship between the US and China. And some of them are very fundamental, such as the issue of Taiwan. And of course, we don't expect any sort of movement in terms of progress regarding those. But when we talk about progress, there seemed to be some sort of reference from the Chinese side as well, despite the fact that there was a stance on military to military communication between the US and China with regards to US sanctions that was still there. But what sort of progress do you think on specific agreements could possibly be there, and whether or not they will amount to anything?
Right, Sana, thank you very much. And it is great to have Professor as well in the program. Let me go back to what he was saying, that it essentially focuses on the rules of the game, right? Remember that Taiwan and, the various, other contentious issues are one thing. But recently we have seen a veritable free fall in the relationship between the two countries, especially after the incident that you mentioned, the spy balloon incident, right? But after that, we have seen that a lot of back channel continued, particularly CIA's director, Bill Burns, actually traveled to China, and there was a meeting. After that, we saw that Wang Yi and American NSA also met, and they have prepared the ground as well. So after today's meeting was important because not only was it a meeting between the foreign policy components of the two countries, but the President Xi also actually joined in, and he sat through 35 minutes of the meeting. So that is great news, because it seems that that free fall has stopped. Now, regarding the coming days, I think there are many sticking points, and one of them is economics. So after this visit, we are going to see that the Secretary of Treasury, Secretary Yellen, and Secretary of Commerce, US Secretary of Commerce, are going to visit China. And after somewhere in the middle of these two visits, we are going to see, Wang Yi's, Foreign Minister's visit to America as well. So after that, I think that things are going to improve. At this moment, Washington is awaiting another very important visit, that is from President Modi. So somehow this visit or this meeting might actually be reduced to the backdrop. But I think the most important thing right now is that they have actually achieved the breakthrough that was needed. Not something concrete, but essentially this understanding that both countries have to work together and they cannot quit on each other. This idea that both countries are going to be enemies and there's going to be a Cold War is a non-starter. As I keep on reminding you, Sana, that this whole talk of decoupling actually belongs to the Cold War era and the previous century, because not technology and trade both have advanced to such an extent that China and America are deeply entangled, and they are so interdependent that you can never even think about decoupling. So there is going to be some kind of hedging from both sides, especially we have seen that regarding microprocessors and some other technologies, they have been very vigilant, and they have been trying to ensure that they have the supplies that are needed in case there is some kind of decoupling or some kind of confrontation. But I don't think that it is going to lead to a Cold War. There are policy pundits and China hawks, and of course hawks in China as well towards the US, who might be disappointed today, and they will try to undermine what has happened today. But I think that today was a great day for the world and for both these countries, because if other countries want to progress, they would like to benefit from both America and China. And the best thing to do that, the best way to do that is to ensure that China and America keep on working. Perhaps they're not going to be bosom buddies immediately, but they will be working together. So that is great news.
All right. Dr. Scott, before this visit, there was also a discussion around how the statements coming in from the US pointed towards perhaps the significance of this visit and pointing towards the fact that this may not be the most significant event of the US foreign policy that is upcoming. There's also, of course, the visit of the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and it's important, especially to Pakistan's perspective, when we take a look at US-China and US-India relationship as well. And moving forward, how will that evolve, especially if we're talking about a positive direction between the US and China? What sort of a changing dynamic would you then see in terms of the US relationship with India?
So let me add two general points to Farrukh's excellent analysis to frame an answer to your question specifically. The first is, we're not just talking about the US and China here. We're talking about many countries who are involved now in this 21st century world, which is why when you discuss US and China, you have to also bring in the Europeans. And indeed, the Chinese Premier Li, is going to France and Germany this week. Why is that? Because China wants an investment deal with Europe, and it wants the lifting of multilateral sanctions. So that economic factor is something which goes beyond the Americans. And the second point here is, I think we're really looking at countries that are considering the possibility of a post-Putin world. That includes India, it includes the Americans, and it includes Pakistan, because let us be very honest here, it will probably be months, even years, but Russia will be defeated in Ukraine. And when it does, the idea of Russia as this influential global power is going to have to be revised because of all the consequences. So countries are having to reframe their expectations. What does that mean with the US and India? It means that the US cannot put itself at odds with India, because it does not want India to side with Russia or to help bail out Russia. It also recognizes that India is a very important developing economic and technology power. At the same time, it cannot try to put all its chips on India precisely because of regional issues, such as India's relationship with Pakistan. So what you have to look at here is that the idea that we have locked ourselves into, which is that there's a specific bilateral relationship that's going to be dominant, whether it's the US and China, the US and India, you can't think of it in those terms anymore. We're dealing instead with a kaleidoscope of countries. So the question will be, after the US has talked to China and after it's talked to India, what will the US say to Pakistan, and what will Pakistan say to the United States, given the whole series of domestic as well as international issues that those countries face right now?
Right, and Farrukh, this is important, especially when we take a look at the stance that Pakistan has had and the kind of questions that have been raised with reference to Pakistan's foreign policy. And we've made it clear, of course, that we want to move ahead with the positive and strong relationships with all countries, and that we enjoy historical and valuable ties with both the US and China. But especially in terms of the US's engagement with India, that perhaps has been a concern in terms of what sort of dynamics we're going to see in the international arena moving ahead, and then especially in terms of how the US is going to perceive Pakistan and China's evolving and strengthening relationship. And we have been trying to have a balancing act in terms of all of these relationships. Do you think that these visits or a trajectory that calls for improvement of relations will reduce this sort of pressure on Pakistan?
Right. Sana, when you talk about India and America, or for that matter, China and America, their relations are not competing values on their own, right? The problem arises when somebody actually, or some pundits actually frame it as if, India has to be a counterweight to China. I don't think that if you listen to people like Ashley Tellis, people who actually played a pivotal role in constructing, or shaping today's America-India relationship, even they realize that asking India to confront China or try to contain China is an impossible ask, because every country has their own interest, and India and China are actually they are neighbors, right? So it will be very difficult to permanently, alienate a neighbor at a time when India and Pakistan relations are not going great either. I think, first of all, my compliments to Professor, because he has put his finger at the nub of the gist of the problem. At this moment, while we keep on looking at power dynamics, and we keep on looking at how China and America might frame their relationship, whether it is positive or negative. My concern is that because of this war that is going on, especially in, because of Russia and Ukraine are involved, and they are some of the massive producers of food grain and umpteen other products. So the entire world is going to face a lot of problems in case this war keeps on prolonging, right? At that moment, it is very important that we don't add to the burden of the problems. Instead of creating more hostilities where relationships can work, they should work. So post-Putin era, we still have to wait and see what actually becomes of that. For now, my concern is that people in sub-Saharan Africa, people in Arab countries, in our region as well, they don't suffer because of food inflation. Even right now, as we speak, the cost of living crisis, right, is going beyond limits in UK, elsewhere, in America. In Pakistan, I think we have ever seen. I don't think we have ever seen such high inflation. So if China and America and India and China can work together, and then India and America, and in the end, I of course want to see a relationship between India and Pakistan as well, a better and improved relation. If that happens, things are going to improve as well. Let us hope that better angels of our nature prevail. Right, sir?
Right. Right, Dr. Scott, I understand that there are a few issues that, of course, are very, very significant and, of course, not easy to resolve. And there is a lot of concern with reference to, for example, the issue of Taiwan and other such issues with the US and China. And beyond that, perhaps while we talk about these issues, we can still expect and hope for some sort of collaboration and stability, especially in terms of economic and trade relations moving forward. But also we've seen in other examples around the world where such issues also sort of become a hindrance in terms of exploring fully the potential that can possibly exist in economic and trade ties between two other countries as well. Do you think that the kind of issues that we have between the US and China can be put on the side while the US and China still continue to move ahead?
I think Farrukh's exactly right. And that is, we could talk about specific issues such as Taiwan, but Taiwan will always be an issue which is there. It's been there for 75 years, or at least the 75th anniversary next year of that country being created after the communists took over Beijing. So it's something where we've lived with it, we'll continue to have to live with it, and hope that each side observes the rules of the game. But beyond that, but beyond that, Farrukh is talking about issues in the 21st century that affect all countries, such as energy security, food security, such as the question of dealing with economic injustice. I don't believe there are angels in international relations, unfortunately, although I wish I could, that Farrukh's angels would show up. But I do believe that a sensible, reasonable politician and statesman will realize that you cannot have stability in the world if you pursue your narrow national self-interest and you do not provide for the self-interest communities around the world. And the US and China are important to that. They are the two largest economies in the world. They are technologically advanced. Do they work with other countries in other regions, whether it be Europe, whether it be Asia, whether it be Africa, which is to provide for supply chains, provide for distribution of food and energy that gives at least a minimum of security? Because if they do not, if they simply say, maybe we'll buy some cheap oil from Russia, maybe we'll sell some military arms here and there, the issues of people who cannot eat, who cannot have safe homes, who face flooding, who face drought, those are the issues that will lead to crises even greater than what we face in Ukraine or in parts of Asia today.
Right, but Dr. Scott, I want to understand something. I understand that the kind of global challenges that we face today require global solutions, and we keep hearing that as something that should be the way forward or should be something that is pursued by countries. But in real terms, is that something that actually is being perceived as a country's own interest as well, and they would want to proceed forward? Because there's lots of economic nuances involved as well, which the countries, due to their bilateral relationships or other self-interests, perhaps do not want to engage in. Just for as example, if we talk about climate change and issues relating to that and financing issues related to that, do you think that countries such as the US and China will be able to collaborate on that front?
It's possible to collaborate. That's the first thing we should say. And even at the lowest point of US-Chinese relations, there have been discussions between the American climate envoy, John Kerry, with Chinese officials. Now, do they translate those discussions into action involving others, involving other countries, other organizations? What we saw in coronavirus and the pandemic was a mixed record, that more could have been done to help countries that did not have access to vaccines, that did not have access to basic protection against the virus, but there were some steps that were adopted on a global level. More can be done with climate change. There is not enough being done, but there are steps which are being taken to try to provide for green energy, to try to provide for the investment, the trade, and then the distribution that is needed. And of course, the crisis in terms of reliable supply chains of food, which has been highlighted by Ukraine, that's come to the fore. What I can tell you is from my perspective is that these issues have been around for decades, but now, in part because of coronavirus and in part because of Ukraine, we have actually had them illuminated as being vital issues. And we are recognizing, or at least some people are recognizing, the voices that are beyond US and China that are calling for solutions. I don't think that national self-interest will ever disappear. I think we'll always have to deal with the challenge of it, but there is more of an approach to the communal now than there has been in my lifetime. So yes, there is a possibility that if you can observe the rules of the game, we can go further, which is the observe the rules of decency for all people in all countries.
Right, absolutely. And Farrukh, I'm glad that the example of COVID was also discussed, because we saw perhaps how certain rules could have been bended and how we were able to collaborate on a global scale than usual how countries react. But in terms of what the situation was and the kind of pandemic that we faced, perhaps that was something that was an anomaly and something that we haven't really seen in times of peace or times of stability. Will that sort of urgency and push that existed in a situation like that can possibly be there when the countries don't really have something, any driving force pushing them towards collaboration?
That is very prescient of you that you actually pointed to COVID response, and I think that actually has shown us that there were delays. Remember that initial COVID response actually took more or less 1 year to materialize. But once it did, we started seeing miracles happening, Sana. One of the fastest developed vaccine. And then IMF actually at that time really stepped forward and really helped a lot of economies, including Pakistan. I keep on bringing up the name of Dr. Raghuram Rajan, again, an Indian, by the way, India's RBI's former governor. But because he was actually structuring the whole response through SDRs, I think that was a moment that gives me a lot of hope in humanity, because if you start working with each other, and it was one of the mega, truly global, crisis. So I think that even right now, while the response might be taking some time, particularly this cost of living crisis, I think that eventually all these forces will come together and realize that something has to be done. One, if, God forbid, the war in Ukraine drags on for a longer period of time, who will actually produce, the goods and services that were there coming from Russia and Ukraine, right? Similarly, who's going to cultivate that kind of land? Especially India and Pakistan could have done a lot, but you know about Pakistan, that we suffered through a massive, flood last year. Mercifully, this time we are saved, but we haven't actually increased the share of the pie in production. So we'll have to look at these dynamics as well. I think that, remember, there are people who will always keep on telling you that relationships cannot improve, that these powers cannot work together. But in the end, we have seen during the COVID days evidence that while there are many naysayers, cooperation is possible. Similarly, the nature of warfare and confrontation is also changing. I mean, in Ukraine, what is happening reminds you of the olden kinetic days, right, where war was essentially fought with weapons and people were killed. Of late, we have seen that a lot of this has shifted to the digital side. And then another wave is coming with AIs. America is developing its own AIs, and we have seen that China is also focusing on that. I'm sure that India and other countries might also be focusing on that technology. With that kind of focus, I don't think that there will be any need to keep on emphasizing or focusing on physical confrontations, may it be a Cold War, may it be decoupling, wherever the interests actually converge. And of course, there will be areas where they will diverge, but where they converge, these countries can come together, because in the end, it is not only about other countries' preservation or betterment, it is about their own people's preservation as well.
Right. Dr. Scott Lucas, last question. Do you expect any sort of interaction between the top leaders of US and China anytime in the recent future?
I think it's possible. I think, as you've indicated already, the next step is probably the visit by the Chinese foreign minister to Washington. As I mentioned earlier, this is alongside a stepped-up Chinese diplomacy with visits to other parts of the world, including Europe. And I think that the Chinese references, which have been numerous in the past 72 hours, that the real turning point or the potential turning point in relations actually came last November when President Biden spoke with Xi Jinping in Bali on the sidelines of the G20 summit. I think that's an indication that if the Chinese feel they're getting that mutual respect that they've asked for, if they feel that their interests are being recognized, and of course, if the Americans think that the Chinese are recognizing not just American interest, but global interest, yeah, I fully expect a summit in 2024. I think the one thing that could complicate the potential Xi Biden summit will be in the middle of the US presidential election campaign. And so I think there'll be that calculation by Biden, which is how will Xi coming to the United States affect his chances for a second term?
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Scott, for joining us and being a part of the debate. Farrukh, anything you'd like to add before we end the segment?
Right. Regarding this possible meeting between the US president and China's president, I think it is likely that there will be a meeting. I can't say as much about a visit from either president to the other country because, as was pointed out by Dr. Scott Lucas, I think that this is election year, and both the Republicans and Democrats keep on using China as a prop against each other, that whosoever actually goes and meets or is seen to be too friendly might be accused of actually fraternizing with the alleged quote-unquote enemy. But I think that for the stability of the relationship, there will be a meeting. There are umpteen, events that are going to take place in coming years, coming months. So we might see a meeting where the stability of their relationship and some kind of balancing act will take place. I think this situation where spy balloons are actually caught, or for that matter, there's fear that in the South China Sea there might be some kind of confrontation, or particularly the Taiwan Straits. That kind of a situation needs to be averted at any rate. Once the elections are over, Sana, and once whatever comes out has come out, then perhaps we are going to see a true statement of principles and approach towards the other country by both sides. I think both sides are patient. they will wait for that time to come, because even in Donald Trump's time, they had managed to sign the first round of FTA. So we have to see whether there can be some progress in that direction also. And then stability of the region is a joint burden. They should be actually focusing on that as well.
All right, Farrukh, we're now going to move on to the next segment, which is about what's happening at home, especially when we talk about the kind of discussions that have been there as part of the parliament and the judiciary. There has been much debate as to how we're going to move forward. Regarding the Supreme Court judgments review law, the petitions that were challenging the law, the verdict on that has been reserved by the Supreme Court, and we're going to be hearing on that soon. But in terms of the discussion that was held, there was a lot of talk about the right of appeal under review law. And Farrukh, this was something that was talked about in terms of whether or not this should be allowed, should actually benefit or can possibly be part of review law. We're going to talk about the procedures as well, but just when we focus on the possibility or the right of appeal under revision, is that something that you think is not problematic or is obvious in terms of how we need to move ahead and that it needs to be part of the review law?
Concern, first of all, is regarding the bench itself. The first question that came to my mind was whether the law that is in contention, whether it is a law, an act, or for that matter, a bill. So it is an act which has been actually ascended by the President himself. My second question would be, who exactly is hearing the case and why? And for that, I don't need to, jog the memory of our audiences, because they know that 3 people have been sitting together on all major cases: the CJ himself and Justice Ijaz, and of course the third gentleman that I keep on, Justice Munib, that I keep on criticizing quite often. So there is a pattern, right? So the next question then is, what on earth are we expecting? Why are we expecting different results? Because in the past they have suspended one law, they have actually written constitution, added to constitution, actually claiming that they are interpreting. Then again they actually went back and said that sorry, we were wrong the last time, and this time we are correct. And then they actually added certain other justices regarding this election case as well. And then whosoever would disagree would mysteriously actually disappear from the bench. So with that kind of approach, do you expect different results? Because Einstein doesn't seem to agree. He says that if you keep on doing the same thing over and over again and expect different results, that is the definition of madness. Now, regarding the right to appeal, let me remind you that it is very important to remember that Supreme Court is the last, court where you actually go and appeal against any decision. Now, the problem with 184.3 is that it is a suo motu case. It doesn't come from another court. In one case, actually, we have seen the Supreme Court actually suspended the high courts. By the way, there's no superior court or inferior court when it comes to federating units and the federation. But somehow, Supreme Court usurped a case from the, Lahore High Court and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa High Court, and they actually appropriated that case and started hearing. So where is any kind of redress if something bad is done? So far, we have seen that there was only right of review, and review actually has very interesting kind of connotations. One, the same judges are going to hear the case. 2, that they are only going to hear the concerns which might be technical. Now, there is a direct, conflict of interest concern here, because they are the same people who actually handed out the verdict. If they are going to hear it, how would they accept that they have erred in the past, right? And the third thing, of course, is that this hearing, this case, was essentially regarding the Chief Justice's own, powers, essentially, because when they have decided whether there should be a review or whether the review should be considered equivalent to an appeal or not. And in that context, I would say that any verdict that comes from this bench will be complicated for me, and I think that they are going to once again err and once again create more laws, which is not their job.
All right, Farrukh, we're now also going to talk a little bit about the tragedy that has happened, especially in terms of the number of lives that we have lost, and there have been hundreds that have been involved, including Pakistanis, of course. And this is important not just in terms of the investigation that needs to be carried out at home, but also what it means in terms of the kind of reports that are coming in, which are very saddening and, of course, quite unfortunate in terms of what sort of distinction was made or how certain nationalities were targeted, and also with reference to whether or not there is an actual deliberate attempt at delaying rescue efforts. When we talk about this tragedy, Farrukh, I want to understand whether or not the reports that have been coming out may be taken as a way forward in terms of being the actual account of the events that have actually happened, and B, how do we establish the strategy that is being discussed with reference to the delaying tactics being used for weaponizing time or having a way around with regards to the refugee crisis in Europe?
Right, Sana, first of all, let us begin by condemning this incident and expressing solidarity with the bereaved families, right? You have already done it. Let me also do it, because my heart goes out to those people who might be in such an economic distress or in such pain that they thought that being smuggled, like animals in such boats is affordable or acceptable. They must have known that there is risk to their lives, and yet they took the risk. So I'm really saddened as a Pakistani that my own fellow citizens would actually go to this extent to escape the economic harsh situation. And in the past also, we have repeatedly seen this film actually playing out, this heartbreaking, this tragic film actually playing out again and again and again. And something needs to be done not only about the smugglers who take these people and then sink their boats or actually risk their lives, but also about the conditions which might be forcing people to flee the country, right? Having said that, the second aspect is regarding education. If Greece is one place that people try to go to, there's another country that is Australia. If you actually are usually surfing on the net, you might see that Australian authorities actually put out ads, visual ads, to actually reach out to people who might be actually going to their country. And usually it is in Urdu or in Pashto or other Dari for that matter as well, so that the people can be educated about possibility of the consequences that are there. This is the second component, that these people need to be warned, educated, and the legal system has to be without loopholes, so that this smuggling does not take place and people actually decide not to go. And if they have to go, they should be using some legal or established channels, not go like cattle in these vehicles, in these boats. The third part is, of course, of the recipient countries. Especially since the Syrian war started, and after that we saw a humongous number of people fleeing and they were destroyed as well. We have seen that there has been a huge reaction in Europe. Greece is a country which already has, uncomfortable relationship with the Muslim countries because of their Turkish relationship as well. And after that also, at that time when Syrian refugees were going into Europe, one of the biggest reactions that actually came from Greece. So, there is no monopoly no monopoly on prejudice. Every country might have its own unfair share of prejudiced people. So I think that authorities also, shut their eyes when people are in distress, when they are drowning, so that the problem goes away. So at this moment, since we still don't know the exact number of people, especially Pakistanis who suffered, we still have to wait for the further details as well. But so far, whatever we have heard is a textbook case of apathy, of neglect, and deliberate staying away from any kind of provision or solution, right from here to Greece or those troubled waters. Yes, sir.
Right. Right. Thank you, Farrukh. Thank you very much for those comments and being a part of the debate. And of course, it is indeed unfortunate what has happened, and we condemn it, and we truly are standing in solidarity with the bereaved families. And this is important, especially not just in terms of the Pakistanis that we've lost, but everyone that have lost their lives and their loved ones. And this is especially important in terms of a reflective approach in terms of what we need to do ahead and how we need to move ahead in order to enable and protect the people and to protect them from going ahead with such decisions. And it's going to be, as Farrukh described, on very various levels that it has to be done. But we hope that we do move around it. That's all that we have from the debate. We'll see you tomorrow.